Um, I'm Susan Halliwell. I'm a person who has loved to paint and dance all my life. As my career, I have been a biochemist researcher, and I spent 25 years in teaching high school science. And I'm happily retired now, and I can devote my time to full-time painting. And actually, I was recently in a dance performance as well. So I started painting as a youngster and really enjoyed it, and I had some paint by number kits. And my grandfather actually was a very talented watercolor landscape painter, and when he saw that I was doing paint by numbers, he reprimanded my parents and said, that's wrong, get her some real paints. So I had oil paints and an easel and painted away at a very young age thanks to my grandfather. In my teenage years, I painted a lot of black and white portraits and also landscapes in oil, and I copied largely from pictures in the newspaper and magazines. When I went to college, I was in the science field. I had a degree in biochemistry, and when I graduated, I moved to Cambridge, Mass, and had a job there. And at night, I took a watercolor painting course, and I was just delighted to learn about transparent layers. And about the same time, I had an interest in Chinese calligraphy, and so I would just practice brush strokes, and I would practice them in transparent layers. And eventually I met up with a wonderful band of bohemian folks, artists, who taught me a lot about stretching canvas and gessoing and using acrylic paint. And so I began to paint with acrylics, but use them very dilute, like watercolors. And so I would take large canvases, and again I would go back to practicing my brush strokes. And for me, then and to this day, what I love about it is just watching the individual brushstroke form, and that in itself is so satisfying and so calming that that's what I really enjoy about painting. And then I find that you can build up these layers and then darken, lighten, go over them, and make incredible patterns. So for years I did lots of paintings of patterns. Gradually people would ask me, well, why don't you do something that's a picture, representational? So I started with flowers and dancers and incorporated them into the patterns, and just progressed in different ways. I do a lot of paintings that look like water, and I usually paint in sets of 3 or 5 so that I'm working on several of the same type of painting at the same time, because I do paint in layers that take a while to dry. After I retired from my teaching job, I was very happy to begin painting full-time, and an interesting thing happened that I listened to the news a lot, and I got very moved by the Aleppo situation I was hearing about on the radio, and that inspired a kind of a dramatic change in my painting, where I started with a grid of the abstract brushstrokes, and then added a figure and also renditions of scenes from Aleppo in the background, and it produced some very striking effects. So, and that's about where I am today. Actually, I spent 6 years of my life in England, from 10 to 16, and then we moved back to Rhode Island. I went to school in New Hampshire at UNH, and it was actually in 1978, when I lived in Cambridge, that I met Bob Rotman, who had lived up in this area of Maine, and he brought me up here and introduced me to many of the artists that I know now, and I really fell in love with Maine at that time, and moved up here in 1990. Oh, I'm told that when I was 3 years old, I used to jump around a lot, and so my father said, get that girl some grace, and off I went to ballet classes, and I worked steadily at ballet from age 3 to age 10, and then we moved to England, so I switched to riding horses. But then later in my life, and as an adult, I went back to ballet, jazz dance, African dance once I came to Maine, And I think all my life dance has been a passion with me.
My name is Stu Silverstein, and I'm an artist, and I've been an artist for a long time, and also a bread baker. I started to bake bread because I couldn't find real bread after I moved to the country. The bread was terrific. The bread that I had when I was young was simply great. My grandmother and my mother would go to the Jewish bakery every day and buy fresh bread. And after I left New Haven and then New York, I couldn't find bread. It was just terrible. It was all packaged in plastic. So I learned how to bake my own. And I also learned how to build simple earth ovens. And often I bake bread outdoors, just like I'm doing today. Just walking around town or walking in the woods, I'm inspired, and I pick up certain things which I use in my artwork. I have all these shoes in front of my studio now, which I painted, and I added mushrooms to the shoes, and I sort of like the combination. It pleases me. Often the mushrooms are close to the ground, and that's where our shoes are, and I just thought I'd put them together and paint the shoes, and I've had a great time, and I'm not done with it. I have several more to work on. I don't really see much meaning in my work. It is what it is. It's probably about nothing, or if you want it to be about something, then it can be. It would be your interpretation. But I don't usually try to make art about anything in particular. I'm basically doing it all the time. I'm baking a lot of bread and I'm making a lot of art. And I work on videos, and Richard Searles and I, who is also from Solon, we made the classic film Dead River Rough Cut, and that's what I do. Well, I've been working on art, which includes filmmaking, for a very long time. Bread baking is not art, but I do that too. And that gives me great pleasure, and I teach workshops on how to bake bread and how to build ovens, and I like to help people with their bread baking projects. I'm an idiot savant. I know bread. That's it. I don't try to do other things. I don't do many types of bread, but I do a few.
Right.
I like baking flatbreads, which I'm making today, and I like baking, they're all sourdough breads, and I like doing the tartine-style bread from San Francisco.
Hi, my name is John Harlow. I'm 28 years old. I live in Skowhegan, Maine. We're sitting here in my studio at 14 Madison Avenue. And behind me is some of my work. Primarily, I work in photography and video. Most recently, photography very heavily, sort of documentary style. I think a lot about subject and photographer relationships, and I try not to use too academic language, but things like cultural preservation, of like documenting a specific time, a specific place. Most recently, while I do make portraits of people that I meet or that I know, when, like as you can see behind me on the wall, when they're all put together, they kind of create a portrait of a place, and that place being Central Maine. These prints are from a body of work that has been ongoing for a few years. It's sort of a collaboration between myself and Paula White, who lives in Athens. She's a friend of mine, and her children are friends of mine. This work was in the Portland Museum of Art biennial this year. So I took these photos in and around her home, and then I sat with her and we looked at small hard copy prints, and she wrote about them. So the inscriptions that you can see underneath are all her writing, and it's in her handwriting as well. And that's sort of something that's important to me in thinking about how the artist typically, historically in documentary photography, has total control over the way that somebody's story is told, the subject story is told, and I think within the last 10 or 20 years, there's been a real push in this genre of thinking more about the role and the responsibility that the artist has for telling somebody else's story. And so for me, I try and have it be as much of a two-way street as possible, I guess. So authenticity is something that I try to think a lot about, or I guess you could say I strive for. The thing is about photography is that photography really is not truth, so to speak. When you photograph something, even if you're in the search for authenticity, the photographer, the artist has control over the frame, and there's like everything else is happening around it, and like when you choose to take the moment. So while I do try to capture things as they happen, I'm still sort of aware that in the end, it is a lot about my own decision making and how I choose to frame things and what I decide to photograph. That being said, I do almost entirely take candid photos. I don't stage any of my photos, or I don't have any of my subjects pose. I think the social interaction is the most difficult part of my practice. I guess I'm a self-taught photographer because when I was in school I was focusing on video, and then I got into photography with a hand-me-down camera after undergrad. So when you walk around with one of these big DSLR cameras, there is kind of a weird barrier, I guess, that the camera creates, because people aren't used to seeing cameras like that necessarily, or they're not used to being photographed by a camera like that, especially just with somebody randomly walking up to them, or somebody that they just met. So a lot of times people will ask me why I want to photograph them, and that's a good question, and it's actually something that I was talking about in a studio visit recently, is why we choose to photograph the people we do. And to be completely honest, I guess I don't know. I guess I can't articulate why a certain moment or a certain person will strike me in a certain way. I don't make work for like museum goers or gallerists. I make work for my family and my friends and the people that live in this area. So it's well, long story short, it's difficult, my interaction with people, but generally is positive. There are photographers who can be really abrasive, who kind of, in my opinion, are like exploitive, and they intrude on people and on people's lives, especially photographers that travel to places that they don't really have any relationship with. They go there, they take these pictures of people for their own benefit, and that's it. The people that they take pictures of may never even see them. And so for me, I had a show downstairs, actually, from where we're sitting right now, when it was an empty store, and it was just all people, local people. And it's funny because people will look at my work, and the first thing they'll try to do is identify where it is or who's in the photo. And it's funny because they don't really look at the artistic quality of it first. They will maybe after. They'll look at the color or composition, which are two things that I get comments on a lot. But for the most part, people are like, oh, I know where that is, or I know that person, or I think I know that person. And so that's sort of interesting to me. And also, that's an interesting segue to what I'm really most recently working on, which is this wall over here. I recently acquired this big box of found photos that are all from the Skowhegan area, and they're all like from the late 70s and 80s. And so I have sort of curated pictures out of that box to kind of create a narrative, but then it's the people have the exact same reaction as when they look at my own photos that I took myself. They say they know where the house is, or they know who the person is. So that's always kind of interesting to me. And then the after reaction, or the long-term reaction, is the story that they all tell, or the narrative that's created around it.
My name is Valerie Abner, and I live down the road a couple of miles. And the reason I'm here today on the Art Day is that I'm a board member of the South Solon Historical Society, which has been charged with maintaining and keeping this building up. It's a volunteer group, it's a nonprofit. So the history of this building is that it was built, the original church building was built in 1842, I believe, and by the mid-1950s, it was falling into disrepair. And so since the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture is just 5 miles down the road, a woman who was affiliated with it came up and said, gee, it's too bad to see this building fall in. And since our specialty is fresco, why don't we fresco the walls and have a contest for the best painters of fresco in the country? And so they did. And they gave each person a wall, or in some cases part of a wall, and asked them to stay within a similar color palette of the colors that you see here, and the blues and greens and browns and sort of rose colors. And they asked them to choose a biblical theme, Old Testament or New Testament. And so they were each given free rein to do whatever they wanted to do. And so the styles are incredibly different, from, very kind of expressionist to much more realistic. I think what I like about the building is its serenity at the same time that it is very stimulating to look at. And the more you look at it, the more you see. You see Isaac and Abraham on the north wall. You see Moses receiving the tablets from God on the west wall. You see the Last Supper on the south wall. And but at the same time, there's a great deal of serenity here. I have come here to just sit and reflect, perhaps when I've been distressed about something. So it has a very calming influence, and a lot of people do that. And it's just sort of such a surprise. It's a very simple building, and you open the door to this wealth of incredible painting with such imagination. And then if you want to know more, you pick up the book and you look at it, and you can find out, exactly what is it depicting, or who was the artist, when was it done, what was the artist's intention. Or you don't have to learn all that. You can just sit and enjoy and look and interpret it for yourself. This building is in South Solon, Maine, 2 miles north of Route 43 on the Meeting House Road. And it is open all the time. Anyone is welcome to come. Everyone is asked to respect the building. So year-round, if you want to come and visit at your leisure, you're quite welcome. Or if you want to schedule an event here, contact our board chair, Andy Davis, because we would like to see the building used. That's one of its purposes, is to have people doing things here that they enjoy.
Hi, my name's James Albert, and I work with stones. Here in Maine, we have so many beautiful rocks that I just figured this is going to be my medium. I started out with these balancing rocks that are counterbalanced rocks by cutting and drilling them. I saw them made out of many wood products. They even up around Sugarloaf Mountain, they make these things out of old skis. So I said, well, I can make those out of rocks. So this is how I started. And then, being a mountain climber, traveling around the world, I saw cairns, the stacks of rocks, everywhere in every country. They use them for markers, they use them for memorials, they use them for headstones, for graves and things like that. So in the wee hours of the night times when you're sitting around in your campsite, started stacking up the rocks, and I started getting really good at it. But they were temporary. So I figured, I'm going to figure out how I can make them permanent. So again, I started drilling them and adding rods to them, and figured, well, I might as well just wire them up and make lamps out of them. So that's how I began making the lamps. So when I drill out one of these rocks, like this here, this nice vase here, I end up with a core, because I'm using diamond tip drill bits and a drill press with a water infusion system, so there's no dust or dirt, or keeps the bits cool while I'm drilling. And I end up with these cores, which are the centers of the rocks. And I had hundreds of these laying around from all the drilling I was doing, so I said, well, what can I do with them? I'll just make candlesticks holders out of them. So that's how that product came about. And again, using the cores, I can make little things like this these are ring holders. When the lady or the man is in the kitchen kneading bread or something, takes off his ring, put it right on there. And I enjoy going out and gathering these rocks. I live up in New Vineyard. That's near the Carabasset Valley. And I'm constantly up in the mountains, traveling on the streams, carrying a backpack, just filling it up with rocks and finding the most interesting rocks that I can find. And then I progressed into, well, what goes along with the balancing wine rocks? Oh, wine glasses. So these are pretty interesting. People always ask me, how did you get the glass through the rock? And it's a secret. But that worked out great. People really enjoy those. They make sets. And the next step was to come up with the taps. These are very popular now. And as well as the lamps. People that have camps on all our beautiful lakes that we have around, they really enjoy having these in their cabins and camps. So I do quite well with those. What I look for in a rock is, first off, the coloring. Things like this, you know, the metamorphic parts. And then the texture, like the colors. See, these colors, they're not just ordinary gray, dull rocks, or our most prevalent granite. And a lot of people tell me what kind of rocks they like. Everyone likes rocks. Everyone's always saying how they always picking up rocks, special rocks that they see. And a lot of people say they like the black rocks with white sections, either a circle around the rock or just a big chunk of quartz mixed in with the slate. So I look for things like that. I have to look for the sizes so that I can make small things like this, and I have to find just the right size rock so that I can put it into the wine glasses. Because if they're too big, then the glass is too heavy, or if they're too small, there's not enough there to attach. And then things like this. I'm always looking for the most unique rocks that I can find. I call this the bubble rock. And lots of times, like I was saying, you don't know what you're going to come out with when you drill down into the center of the rock. That's always interesting too. And when you cut into a rock, I use diamond tip saw blades to cut through the rocks, but it reveals really nice shades and colors that are inside the rocks, like on those bookends. I make these things we call wind wigglers that, and those just set out on the deck, sit out in your yard, and as the wind blows, they sway back and forth, back and forth. Where I live, there's so many rocks, and like I said, I'm always in the mountains and in the streams, and you can see the most wonderful rocks. And lots of times, why I spray them with a polyacrylic to make them shiny and bring out the colors. A lot of people will go to a stream and see a beautiful rock and pick it up. When they get home, they look at it and they say, why did I pick this rock up? It's dull. But once you wet it again, then it brings out its character. In my studio, on the floor of my studio, there's literally hundreds of rocks laying around that I've gathered. And while I'm working, say making a lamp, they sort of speak to me. This one's gonna go with that one. And I always stack them up before I drill them and put the rods in to get them as close as I can to just balancing on their own. So that way they fit together much better. So out of that array of rocks that I have, I can pick and choose which rocks I need for the application. People can find my art here at the River Roads Gallery in Skowhegan, and I don't have a website. I do quite well here, and I'm not that technologically advanced yet to have a website, but mostly it's right here in Skowhegan.